All right, perfect. All right, thank you all for coming. So today we're going to talk about the Brassicaceae family. And this family is otherwise known as the Crucifer family. It kind of goes by multiple names. Most commonly, we call this the mustard family. And so this is actually a pretty large family. There's over 300 genera and over 3,000 species found worldwide, might even be upwards of over 4,000 species at this point. Primarily, this group is going to consist of herbaceous plants, but we do have a few shrubs as well. Some of the characteristics that are found in this group is primarily by their flower structure. So most of the flowers that you're going to see in this group are going to be four-petaled, almost have a type of cross-shaped flower, and they have two long and two short stamens. And eventually, these flowers are going to give way to fruits. And a lot of times, this fruit will become dry at maturity, and then it'll kind of divide, and then it will, a lot of times, split open and even push out seeds for dispersal. And so, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this family is because this is very much an economically important family because so many of our leafy crops are crops that we use for consumption as well as for condiments and things of that nature come from this family. So anything from our mustard to arugula, Brussels sprouts, bok choy, cabbage, cauliflower, collards, kale, broccoli, kohlrabi, rutabaga, turnip, radish, horseradish, all the things. So let's kind of talk a little bit more about those plants because I didn't want to devote this whole talk to mentioning each of these different vegetables. I'm going to kind of lump most of these vegetables into one slide, and then we're going to talk about some other members of this family. That's what we're going to focus on today. So a lot of the brassicas that I just mentioned, they are what we call cool season crops. Traditionally, a lot of these plants are ones that we are going to be growing in the spring and fall months. A lot of times they are going to be reduced in quality over the hot summer heat. And so we traditionally plant these in cooler temperatures. These are often known as cold crops. And I'm Oh, sorry, hold on. Got another person admitted. So these are often called cold crops, and they all have very similar growing conditions. And I kind of won't like go into detail about that today. But a lot of times these are some of the few vegetables that we could say tolerate some of the, kind of more shaded conditions. Most vegetables are going to need full sun, but these might be one of the few ones that can actually tolerate a tad bit of shade. But we're growing a lot of these for either their leaves for consumption, or we are consuming kind of the underground stem or root portion of the plant. Now, traditionally, these are what we call superfoods. These are very nutritional, healthy vegetables. So these are ones we would recommend for sure as part of your daily diet because they're high in different vitamins and minerals from vitamins A, C, calcium, potassium, iron, fiber, and they also contain folate. So some really good health benefits from these plants. And so what's interesting to note about these plants is actually quite a few of these cool season vegetables are all cultivated from the original wild cabbage. And so a lot of them have been hybridized really over hundreds of years and have been, grown into a lot of the popular crops that we have today, such as kale, broccoli, cauliflower, collard greens, cabbage, and kohlrabi. All of them actually belong and originate from the wild cabbage. So they come from this particular species, which is very, very interesting. So these have been hybridized over time for them to have the the qualities and characteristics that we would want from them, whether it be the leaves that we consume or even the flowering buds that we consume with broccoli. One other thing I'll mention with these, in addition to having similar growing conditions, they all have their similar share of issues. Primarily the caterpillars very much like to consume these, particularly the cabbage white butterfly. And with the cabbage white butterfly, that is an introduced butterfly species. That is not one that is actually native to Kentucky, even though we may think it's native because they're everywhere and we see them every year. But they are actually not. They have been introduced, and so it's very common for their caterpillar to feed on these crops and become a nuisance, if you will, as well as things like our cabbage loopers too. So a lot of our green worms, if you will, can plague these crops. But again, just kind of wanted to showcase these vegetables because this is a large portion of this Brassicaceae family. These are a lot of vegetables that we consume daily. And so I want to go ahead and switch gears though, and I want to talk about some other plants that also belong to this family that you may not have known belong to this family. So let's kind of talk about them. And some of these you may be familiar with, others this might be the first time you're introduced to. So let's kind of dive right into it. The first one, I love this plant. This is a very nice ornamental. This is called candy tuft. Its scientific name, Iberis sempervirens. So Iberis meaning that this originates from the Iberian Peninsula of Spain primarily, but also found in other parts of Europe. And then sempervirens means always living, always alive. And I have to say, this is quite a strong, durable plant. So this is very much a low growing type ground cover. It has more of a mounding shape. And what's really nice about it is it has these tiny needle-like leaves that makes it look almost like it's a small evergreen in itself. And depending on what climate you're growing these, they can be somewhat semi-evergreen in nature. And the nice thing about this is it will keep typically that lush green growth even during the hot summer heat. Whereas a lot of our other ground covers, I just think of like moss phlox, for example, can sometimes struggle, and you might get some browning and yellowing and things of that nature with the foliage. Whereas candy tuft usually stays really nice even after it's done blooming. And so speaking of blooms, so this blooms in early to late spring, and it's a pretty long-lived period of a few weeks. And they produce these beautiful clusters of these small white flowers. And if you look at each individual flower closely, you'll notice the four petals. So again, kind of the main characteristic of this family is those four-petaled flowers. And as I've mentioned before, when botanists tried to group plants into families prior to DNA testing, they relied on the composition of those flowers. Now, there are newer cultivars on the market that have kind of a more pinkish and lavender coloration to the flowers as well. But primarily the ones that you see are all white flowers. And this plant it can do well in a semi-shaded area, but it's going to flower more profusely for you in full sun. So just something to note there. After it's done flowering, it has those dried fruits that I mentioned before. They split open, and these seeds actually do have a little wing to them where they could potentially be dispersed by the wind. But traditionally, not all of the Brassicaceae have winged seeds. A lot of times they're dispersed potentially by wildlife, or they're just dispersed into the soil nearby and they kind of form these colonies, if you will. Flowers are a very good early source for pollinators, such as butterflies, to enjoy. And then the birds will also feed on the seeds too once they come into play. So again, this is a really good ornamental. Definitely would recommend it, especially if you have an area where you need kind of a low growing ground cover. All right. This one might be familiar to a few of you. So this is one of our native spring wildflowers. This is cutleaf toothwort. And the name cutleaf toothwort it's quite a name. A lot of people think it's because of the lobes of the leaves, but in actuality, it's because the underground stems have these almost little tooth-like projections. And what those tooth-like projections are is they are actually leaf scars that are occurring from the previous year's growth that has died off. So that's where its name actually comes from, with the toothwort portion. So, as I mentioned, this is an early spring wildflower. This is found in a lot of our Kentucky woodlands. They primarily like moist woods, although I have seen these kind of growing on drier hillsides as well. This is what we refer to as an ephemeral. And so a lot of our spring wildflowers are ephemeral, where basically they will produce their vegetative growth, their foliage, then they will flower, set seed, and then they will die, and then you will not see it the rest of the year at all. So pretty much they're gone by the time we reach summer. And so with the cutleaf toothwort, that you'll notice is it'll bloom, set fruit and seed, and then the foliage is going to start turning yellow. It's actually kind of a pretty yellow color, a little bit of, you know, uh, kind of an accent, if you will, for some foliage, but eventually that will yellow and then completely die off. Now, with this plant, primarily we're looking at the flowers, although this does produce two sets of different leaves on it. It has a rosette of basal leaves, and then you'll see the flowering stems that have kind of more of those deeply cut lobes of whorled leaves. Usually they're in threes or fours. The leaves and rhizomes are actually edible. And so that is something you're going to notice with the Brassicaceae family. There are a lot of edible species found in this family. A lot of times with this plant, it can have a little bit more of a spicy flavor to it. So again, kind of typical. This is our mustard family, so it has a little bit more of that spicy flavor. This has been used by indigenous Native American populations as well. Primarily, though, we just see it as a spring wildflower and either enjoy it, or maybe we are trying to put some of these as an ornamental into our landscape just for that spring flowering. And if you look close at the spring flowers, they are very fragrant, and a lot of times they're going to be more of a white to pinkish color. Now the flowers are interesting. They're not very graceful flowers, if you will. They're very floppy. And they don't quite open fully, so they kind of create more of a bell-shaped appearance rather than that cross shape that's typical of the Brassicaceae family. But this is a good early nectar source for especially our bee populations. And I got to move this over. But if you look at, let me backtrack here. Let me see if I can move this thing. There we go. All right. So after it is done flowering, it is going to produce a fruit, and the fruit is very interesting. So this picture that's beside the flower is actually the fruiting structure. and it looks like it has kind of this slender tip, and that tip is what they refer to as a beak. So you can kind of see here that it's like, oh, this almost looks like the outline of like a bird's beak. So very interesting characteristic there. And eventually this seed pod is going to turn brown and then it's going to split open as well. Now, with these plants, they typically do flower before we have leaf out with a lot of our deciduous trees. So a lot of times these could be flowering even a couple weeks before our trees start to leaf out. So this is, again, a very early spring blooming plant. All right, so I'm switching gears completely. I'm going from a native species to a very invasive species because this is, again, this family is kind of full of these interesting plants. And so let's talk about garlic mustard. So garlic mustard is unfortunately a very prevalent invasive species. This is originally from Europe, and it was introduced really early on within early settlement of the Americas. Settlers brought this in for both culinary and medicinal purposes. So culinary, meaning that if you were to crush the leaves of this plant, they do kind of have a garlicky smell to them. So that's kind of the main reason for that. Medicinal purposes, you know, not really a whole lot there to back up scientifically. So I would not recommend this plant as a medicinal plant. Um, and with this, it is just horrific in that it sets seeds very easily. It can form really large colonies, especially in our woodland areas. It very much outcompetes a lot of our native plant populations. And so kind of to put that into perspective. So whenever it flowers, you can have about 500 seeds per plant. And so that's pretty ridiculous how easy this plant. Of course, not all of these seeds are going to germinate, but still, that's one of the reasons why you see these ridiculous groves of garlic mustard all over the place. And so what's interesting about garlic mustard is it is what we consider a biannual. And so it meaning that it's going to take 2 years to complete its life cycle. So the first year it's going to form its foliage first. So traditionally those are kind of a more rosette scalloped leaf formation. And then comes the second year, then we start to see these flower stems that have kind of that stereotypical triangular leaf that is pretty easy to identify whenever we're seeing garlic mustard out, here in the landscape. And then they will give way to those tiny little white flowers, those four-petaled white flowers. So, unfortunately, very much problematic. Now, something else that this plant has going for it that also helps to promote its large colonies too is it has what we call allelopathy. And what that means is it is able to release phytochemicals into the soil. And these chemicals are actually detrimental to other native plants around it. It can not only stunt the growth of the native plants, but it can destroy the relationship those plants have with their root systems with the beneficial fungi called mycorrhizal fungi that attach to the root systems and help aid in uh, water and nutrient uptake. And so with garlic mustard able to do that, then that means a lot of plants that maybe were nearby are going to eventually die off because of this chemical mechanism that it has. So, not only is it producing hundreds and hundreds of seeds, but it's producing these chemicals that's disrupting, the root growth and relationship with beneficial relationship with fungi that other plants have. So it is definitely a menace for sure and can be very difficult to remove, unfortunately. So just kind of wanted to bring awareness about this plant to you all. Because a lot of times we think of honeysuckle and we think of privet and we think of oriental bittersweet, all of those invasive plants, but garlic mustard is very much problematic here in Kentucky. All right. Now, this plant I wanted to showcase because this is a very special plant and one that I've actually been able to see in person. So we do have several rare species of plants here in Kentucky, some that are very much threatened and endangered. And a good example of this is the Kentucky glade cress. And so this species is found in only two counties here in Kentucky, and that's in Bullitt and Jefferson counties. This is a tiny, tiny plant, and that's why I have this picture here so you can see this person's fingers in comparison to the plant. It is so small, so it could be easily overlooked or stepped on, unfortunately. But this is a very rare cress species. And the reason being is because it has very particular environmental conditions for it to grow. So it really is only going to grow in certain areas where it's very flat, thin soil. And, really two of the regions that we still have relatively healthy populations are going to be found in Apple Valley Glade and Pine Creek Barrens. And so Pine Creek Barrens is actually a nature preserve that's run by the Nature Conservancy. And that's where I have seen this plant. So it is found kind of right there, almost directly on the trail and beside the trail. Um, if you ever go to Pine Creek Barrens, that is open. It's a really good, lovely hike, lots of native wildflowers. But you can definitely see this little guy there. But they're tiny, like I said. I mean, they are only going to get a few centimeters tall. When it's not flowering, the leaves are pretty nondescript. But it produces, again, kind of those cute little four-petaled flowers, really into late winter, into early spring. Um, the main reason this plant is also becoming threatened is because it's so particular um, to a certain ecosystem. A lot of those ecosystems are unfortunately not protected. And so a lot of the areas that are not in these nature preserves have been basically destroyed due to both residential and commercial development. Especially with this being so close to Louisville, that's probably to be expected just with city expansion. And so really, these different groups are trying their best to keep this plant protected, especially in these two nature preserves. So that is just kind of a cool plant to see and really not that far away from here if you all ever did want to do kind of a little trip over to see it in person because it is a cute little nifty plant and hopefully can continue to be protected. All right, so moving on. So I find this family to have a lot of cool representatives. So this one is very unique. This is called Rose of Jericho. We also refer to this one as the resurrection plant. Now, that's not to be confused with there's a couple other plants that are called resurrection plants that you could buy even as like a house plant, and that is not this plant. This is kind of the OG resurrection plant. And it is found in more arid desert type regions of the Middle East. And so where this grows is it finds its way in these dry channels and kind of little riverbeds. And whenever there's a rainy season, this plant is going to be growing, flowering, and then setting seed. And then whenever the channels dry up, then this plant is going to basically shrivel up and die. And you can kind of see here, this top picture here is what it looks like all shriveled up. So the branches and the seed pods are kind of curled inward. It's like all tucked in. And actually, if they get a pretty decent windstorm, this almost acts like a tumbleweed where it could become loose and then just kind of, fly away, if you will. But if it's able to stay in place, why it's called the resurrection plant is if it stays in place and then the rain returns, um, a lot of times the dried stems and roots of this plant are going to be taking in that water, and it's going to cause them to expand. And it expands to the point where it's going to unfurl. It's going to unfurl from kind of that fetal position, and it's going to expose the fruits that have been there, that have stayed there, that have the seeds. And so once it's exposed, it's actually going to be able to catapult the seeds outward, especially if it gets hit by raindrops. And that's going to allow the plant to, be able to spread its seeds, be able to complete the reproduction process, if you will. Um, and so with that, the plant is actually not alive. It's funny because we say resurrection, but the plant is actually very truly dead when this is happening. But somehow it's adapted where its old tissue has still been able to kind of act as these channels for the water and are still able to expand and then kind of allowing it to release its seeds over time. So, so very neat. So you can kind of see a picture, the bottom picture here, of what the plant when it is alive actually looks like. So, again, pretty nondescript, kind of has this rounder foliage that's silvery green in color, and then you get those small little white four-petaled flowers. But yes, this is the true resurrection plant, and just very cool. If you look on like YouTube or other videos, you can actually watch a slow motion of, the old stems kind of expanding and opening up. So it's very neat to see. All right. This is one you all might be familiar with because it is a weed, or what we consider to be a weed, um, here in Kentucky. It's a pretty common garden weed. It's not native. Shepherd's purse is originally from Europe and Asia, but it was introduced here into the United States. A lot of times this is found in a lot of disturbed areas, old construction sites, new home builds, things of that nature. And so you can kind of see here the life cycle of the plant. As a seedling, you can see, with these leaves, they kind of start to develop this lobed foliage, and especially as they mature, that lobed nature becomes more prevalent. These will produce really loose clusters of flowers, and so people might notice this plant more whenever it's actually in bloom. And so it spreads in nature because of its seeds. It easily self-seeds as well. And so, can be a problem and one that we may, try to remove constantly in our garden beds. Um, but something that a lot of people may not realize with shepherd's purse is it is actually edible. So the leaves, seeds, and flowering shoots are edible. They can be eaten raw or cooked, but something I will kind of stress is, typically, you know, and I'm gonna talk about this with other plants. If you try to like harvest these out, like say in your lawn or landscape, just know where it comes from. If you have pets out there that use the bathroom or you have stormwater runoff, you don't really know what these leaves have been soaked in. And so I would just be very cautious if you're going to actually, try to consume them because I would worry about bacteria, other kind of microorganisms, things of that nature that might be on there. So just kind of keep that in mind, especially if you want to try to forage this plant. But if you do consume this can be used in salads. They have generally a kind of mild peppery taste to them. And the seeds can even be ground up and used as a flavor in different soups, as well as even you can use the root as a substitute for ginger too. So this is actually pretty common in traditional Chinese cuisine as well. So they have traditionally used this kind of as an herb for their cooking. Otherwise, even though this is an introduced species, the flowers will still attract some of your pollinators, your bees, butterflies. Um, it may also attract some unwanted animals, such as deer. Deer really enjoy eating this, just like humans may want to eat it. So, which it's like maybe you'd prefer the deer to eat the weeds in your yard rather than other ornamentals, but if they're there, they could be hitting up other plants. So just keep that in mind. This is a delicacy among deer. All right, let's talk about stock. So again, this is such a large, broad plant family, and I love it because we're talking about different native plants, we're talking about these invasive weeds, then we're getting into even some ornamental species such as our candy tuft, and now here our stock plant. And so stock, you might be familiar with this. This is a very common cut flower. And actually, it is very important in the cut flower industry. So this is a member of the Brassicaceae family. It may not look like it because a lot of the cultivated varieties of stock that we have generally have this double flower. So they have this double flower where it's harder to see its reproductive parts. Um, and it just develops, so many more petals. Traditionally, though, original stock species may have kind of more of the original Brassicaceae type flower, as well as those flowers are generally kind of more white to pink. But then you have so many of these cultivars that are out there that can be white, pink, purple, even red and yellow. So a full spectrum of coloration. And so again, this is grown widely as an ornamental, in particular as a cut flower. I've used these. Actually, they were used as part of my wedding bouquet. I had some purple cultivars of stock, and so I can tell you they hold up really well, and they just make for a beautiful flower. Now, this is something that more than likely we're bringing in, though. Generally, we're not growing a lot of stock actually like in our garden beds. You can start these from seed, but this is kind of more of what we call a cool season plant. It's very similar in that nature to like say snapdragons, where these grow better kind of in more of a cooler temperature setting. So unfortunately, when we get our summer heat, this is not something that's going to fare very well. And as well, too, if you're growing this, and you're starting these from seed, just keep in mind, um, that there might be, it may not, I'm trying to think, depending on the variety that you have, maybe consider it an annual, biannual, of that nature. So you'd have to see if they would actually bloom for you the first year, if you were trying to plant this in your garden bed. But when you look at a lot of these cultivars, a lot of the ones that we grow as cut flowers, what's interesting too is typically this double flower here is pretty sterile. So even if you wanted to grow some of these in your garden, you're probably just growing it as a cut flower because it's really not going to have any benefits to pollinators, more than likely as a result. So this is another ornamental. So this is a popular annual variety that we grow. It's called Sweet Alyssum. A lot of times we also just call it Lobularia too. We call it by the genus name. And so this is a great filler plant. It's not native. It's found primarily in Europe, but we don't have to worry about any invasive tendencies here because it's killed off by frost. But this is perfect for containers, or even kind of the front of landscape beds. It's a very low growing spreader, and it has these beautiful clusters of those white flowers. There are other cultivars that are out there on the market that are kind of more lavender, pink, purple. I've even seen some that almost resemble something like lantana, where they have kind of that sunrise or sunset kind of pinky orange, type coloration to them. So generally these are very, very good flowering plants, very profuse flowers. Now, with that in mind, though, a lot of times these will start to struggle as we get into the summer heat. And so this is something where this might be generally better used as, a good cool season flower for the spring or going back into the fall months, rather than keeping it going during the summer months. You can keep these going during the summer. I have done that, but I would put them kind of in a more cooler, shadier part, of maybe a deck or a porch, and then just kind of expect that it may not bloom as much for you, just because of those hot temperatures. Again, you start to notice a trend with a lot of these plants. They're very cool season. They like those cooler temperatures, rather than that summer heat. So it's not just with the vegetables we're talking about, it's the case with a lot of these flowers too. Generally, I do see some pollinators go to this, as well. So some of our bees, will go to Sweet Alyssum, although I would not consider this wouldn't be my go-to annual, I guess, for pollinators. I would pick other annuals over this first off. All right. So again, we are all over the place with this family. So we're going from a flowering ornamental, to kind of another edible crop, and that is wasabi. So wasabi does belong to the Brassicaceae family, and that kind of makes sense because this usually is very hot and spicy, like horseradish. So very similar in that regard. With wasabi, it is found in Japan, South Korea, other parts of Asia, where it grows naturally along rivers and streams and kind of higher mountainous areas. And so when you look at the plant on the bottom, so they kind of have this palmate vein on the leaves, and the leaves can either be toothed or divided into 3 to 6 leaflets, just depending. And then it will produce clusters of those tiny, tiny cross-shaped flowers again. And generally, they are going to be blooming earlier in the season, late winter into early spring. Um, Again, not a crop that we're really growing here, but it may be something that we are consuming as in some of these international cuisines. So these are made kind of the edible part. It comes from the rhizomes, which are broken up and ground up to make this green paste. And that green paste, both in smell and taste, is very pungent, very strong. I have to say, and I have to admit this, whenever I was in college, I did not know what wasabi was, and I um, just kind of saw it just like as a little side item to my dish. And I put it on my food, not knowing really what it was. And I took one bite and was, completely like just aghast at how strong it was. I did not care for it. I will say that. I think now that I know what it is and how you should be consuming it, that's a little bit different. But for sure, if you've never tasted wasabi before, it might, you know, you may not quite, like the taste quite as much, because it is very strong. Um, but oftentimes, this kind of green paste, if you will, can be served in a number of ways, from in sushi, salads, on poultry, sausage, rice, soups, and different garnishes. Um, you can even take, and you can see in this top picture here, some of the flower and leaf stalks, and you can you can pickle them into this Japanese pickle called a wasabi zuke. Can't say I've ever had that, but it is definitely an option. And then you are able to consume these leaves as well, the young tender leaves that can be put on salads and sandwiches. But one thing you do need to be mindful of is, especially if if you are eating them raw, sometimes they can cause a little bit of digestive distress. So just kind of be mindful that you may just want to actually cook it so you don't get any of the ill effects from it. But more than likely, we're not ever going to be growing this plant. We're just eating it kind of in restaurants, or we're purchasing it for a particular meal in mind. But just kind of wanted to bring some, awareness that this is a plant that is a member of this family. And some of you may really like the taste of wasabi, which, good on you for that. I will say it's not my favorite, so, but probably because I had that first bad experience with it. All right, so let's move on to our last plant. So this is the watercress. So this is a plant that we would consider more invasive in nature. Um, it has kind of naturalized all over North America. This is kind of the first aquatic species that we've talked about today. And it is kind of very flexible with where it grows. It can be completely submerged. It can be floating on the water. It can be just on mud surfaces. It's going to thrive best, though, kind of in those cool flowing streams. But again, very easy grower, very fast grower in that it can kind of take over. And so you do have to watch this plant because it will form colonies all around. Now, the foliage is interesting. It does have kind of this pinnately compound divided foliage if you look at it closely. Um, the leaves are kind of more this oval to egg shape, and they're generally arranged in leaflets of 3 to 7. Um, they are cultivated and edible, so you can eat the young shoots and leaves. Um, of this plant. Again, it has kind of more of this peppery nature to it. It does have some benefits where it's generally rich in vitamins and minerals. So it does have that going for it. So even though it's an invasive, I mean, generally, I guess, it does have some good properties as a potential crop. But with that in mind, again, this kind of goes back to the shepherd's purse. Just because you see it somewhere doesn't mean that you can just go ahead and harvest it and eat it. You don't know where it's been. You don't know if it's in an area where there's been chemicals sprayed. You don't know if there could be some microparasites around. Even if you washed it thoroughly, you just kind of run that risk. So don't ever consume anything that you're just kind of harvesting from the wild if you don't really know where it's been. Don't want to risk parasites, E. coli, anything of that nature. But with that in mind, watercress is pretty well in cultivation. A lot of times people will grow these in different tank systems, so different kind of aquaponic settings that you could purchase this, say in a grocery store and be able to safely consume it. Um, if you're looking at the scientific name and you see nasturtium and you're like, oh, that's neat, is it related to the garden nasturtium that we see that has the lovely orange flowers that we put in our vegetable gardens? They are actually two totally different plants. Not only are they different species, they don't even belong in the same genera. So, this is not related in any way to the actual garden nasturtium, if you were wondering. So, no similarities there, but similar genus name and then common name to the garden nasturtium. All right. So with that, that is kind of a oh, stop share. Let's stop share. All right. That is just a general view of the Brassicaceae family. Does anyone have any questions before we leave for today? And you can feel free to unmute or put anything in the comment section too. All right. Well, I appreciate you all for coming. I appreciate you all for coming. I think it's probably been just a nice day that everyone wants to get outside this week at this point, maybe do some early gardening. So I appreciate you all for joining me. And if you can, please join me for the next one. That's going to be April 8th on the Lamiaceae family. So we're going to talk about the mint family next month. So that'll be a good time. I will go ahead and send you all this presentation via email so you all will have it available, and then you will be able to watch the recording online on the YouTube channel as well. So thank you all so much. Appreciate you.